Hello there, and today's lecture is about culture and communications. And this is going to be a two-part lecture. So we're going to start today just going through some of the preliminaries, and this will go about 10 to 12 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. And then part two of this will actually go into more detail about it. So when you're talking about culture and communications, we have to first look at how culture actually is different between different cultures around the globe. And to understand how it affects us here in the United States, North America, we have to go back and look at 5 different times in the past 100 years. So the first thing we're going to look at is going to be 1900. Then we're going to look at 1917, 1940, 1950, and then briefly 1990. Now, the reason why this is important is because the United States has not always been looking at different cultures and trying to understand it. Matter of fact, if you go back to 1900, you'll see that there were 4 things that actually occurred in those few years that are kind of important. First of all, we went to a gold standard, which means that for every dollar there was gold backing it. So we were very much of a self-enclosed nation in terms of the value of our money. Then Roosevelt became president in 2001, and then in 2004, very important, that he launched what he was called the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if you're not familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, that's basically the doctrine of isolationists. It goes back to James Monroe, one of our first presidents. Now, what the doctrine of isolationists says is that we will not be involved with others, and we do not expect them to be involved with us. We will not get involved in other governments. We do not expect other governments to be involved in our government in shaping us. So we basically just did everything our own way. We didn't have a lot of culture coming on. We had migrants coming in. We had them coming from China, Mexico, Ireland, the Jewish population. But they pretty much came in and they didn't change our culture. They assimilated to our culture. But things started to change, and they started changing in World War I, which went from 1914 to 17 and 18. And what caused the change there is that this was a world war, which means that it was unlike other wars that was just between 2 countries like maybe France and England. This was actually a world war. Primarily it was in Europe, and we sent over 1 million troops over there. Now, during that time, we had a lot of migrants coming over from Europe to the United States, but what was even more important, that in 1917, 1918, all of our soldiers came back. When they came back, they brought other cultures with them. So all of a sudden, they're coming back bringing the ways of other cultures that they have been used to. And you're going to understand more about this when we get into the different cultural traits that was created by Gers Hofstede in the 1980s. But then in 1940, we had World War II. The same thing happened again. Here we send millions of troops over to Europe and also over to Asia too. And at this point, when they come back, now they're bringing both European culture, Middle Eastern culture, and Asian cultures. So our culture now is starting to change quite a bit. But in the 1950s, there was a lot that actually happened. In the 1950s, the United States was considered the dominant force economically, also in many ways culturally too. So as you can see here, pictures of Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, I think that's Danny Kaye in there. All of a sudden, our movies, our television programs were seen as a culture that was westernized that other cultures wanted to assimilate into. Now, up until 1990, which is the next thing I want to talk about here, we pretty much had people who would come over to the U.S. and they would assimilate into our culture. Now, this is kind of what you would call the melting pot. Unlike now where we have more of a salad bowl, the melting pot was people would come over, they would assimilate into our culture, they would kind of leave their culture behind. But as we got into the 1990s, and especially after 2001 with 9/11, we started seeing the melting pot became more of a salad bowl. So the example of a salad bowl is that you have lettuce and tomatoes and croutons and onions. The melting pot is like a stew bowl. A bowl of stew. It's going to have potatoes, carrots, beef, maybe onions in there. But the difference is the stew, everything will start tasting alike because it all assimilates. Everything becomes alike. But in the salad bowl, the crouton will never taste like the tomato and the lettuce will never taste like the crouton. So therefore, now what we see is we have cultures coming over after 2001, and they're continuing to keep their existing culture in the way that they function, in addition to taking on some of the current U.S. cultures. So when you look at the global centers for business, you can see there are three primary ones: North America, Asia, and also in Europe. Now, not to say that Russia, Africa, Australia, and South America are not global business centers, but these three here are the ones that we see the most culture coming out of, that's coming to the U.S., particularly in terms of business. Now, when you look at culture, there are several definitions of what culture is. We're going to look at ethnic culture, but there's also gender culture, there's generational culture, there's religious culture, there's even educational culture. But we're going to look primarily at ethnic culture and how that affects us in the way we communicate. So what does all this have to do with communications and speech and giving presentations? Well, the point here is that if you don't understand the culture that other people are coming from and what makes up their culture, you do not have the ability to effectively communicate with them. You have to understand that when you're saying things or presenting things, how they are understanding it or how they're maybe not understanding it. So we're going to look very briefly at just these three right here. The high context, low context is going to be the first one. Now, if you look at this, particularly look at the right diagram at the very bottom. A low context person is someone who has to hear things very explicitly. There's very clear rules and there's details and is very direct, compared to the high context where things are implicit, they're situational. A lot of non-verbals are in there, and there's a lot of rules, but those rules are more indirect. So if you look on the left side, you can see Japan, Germany, US. These are very low context compared to the other side, which is very high context. Now, if you are trying to understand this, the easiest way to look at this is going back over to the right diagram and realize the low context are two people who are communicating, they're talking, where on the high context, you don't see them talking, you see them reading nonverbals in that. So to give you a good example of this, someone from a low context is someone who wants explicit instructions. So for example, if I was to tell you that we're going to have an exam in our class next week, the low context person would probably sit there and say, what's going to be on the exam? How many questions? Are they multiple choice, true, false, or essay? How long do we have to take the exam? Is it going to be in this classroom? So the issue here is they're trying to get all the explicit information. They want to know explicitly what is going to happen. Now, the high context person is a little different, because they are going to look from their historical view of me as the instructor, knowing the type of person that I am. They're going to look at the past exams I've given. I've given multiple choice or true, false before, so they're going to assume that's what's going to be done. So they're going to look more at the nonverbal and what is, let's say, that's implied and not necessarily explained on it. So once again, look at where some of these low contexts are. Northern Europe, mainly Europe, North America. These are the people who have to have very, very clear explanations. Where the other parts of the world are high context, which means they're not going to ask as many questions, so you may have to give them more information so that they don't misinterpret what you're trying to say. The next one is the time. Monochronic compared to polychronic time. Now, first of all, if you look at the little map, you can see the polychronic is what's red, and that's actually the majority of the people. The monochronic is blue, which is North America, Europe, and also Australia. When you look at the left side, this gives you kind of a good understanding of the difference, because the blue is the monochronic. Monochronic is explained as we go very systematically. It may be it takes 30 minutes, it may take an hour, it may take 2 hours. When you come to the classroom, you know we're going to be here for 1 hour. I will not take you past that 1 hour. We may be cut short a little bit, but we have to stay within that 1 hour period because you have another class that starts the next hour. So if you look at the blue clock here underneath it, you got a bunch of little dots. Those represent the components that to fit in the time frame of that 1 or 2 hours, we could hit certain components. Now look at the red side. The red clock underneath that, you can see you have all those components, but they're in a circular, which means that they all have to be completed. And whatever time it takes to complete it is the amount of time you're going to spend. So you may find in a monochronic time where the person does not get finished communicating, but in a polychronic, they're going to keep communicating until they get finished, no matter how long it takes. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Maybe you've been into some presentations before. I've been in several church services where the minister is supposed to get finished at 12 noon, but 12:10, 12:15, 12:20, he or she, they're still talking. And they may make a comment like, this is so important that I'm going to go a little bit longer because you need to hear this. Okay, that's a polychronic time. That's saying that you need to hear all these things no matter how long it takes. You may find that you go to a classroom in a different country, like let's say over into Romania or to Bulgaria. You may find that the professor there just keeps going and going, and you may find you're late to the next class because that professor is going to continue until he gets finished or she gets finished with what she's saying. That's the difference between monochronic and polychronic time. Next one is achievement and inscription. We're going to touch just lightly on this here. This is the third one. It says basically social stratification, the categories of people fall into on hierarchy based upon wealth, status, or power. And basically what this is saying is that an inscription type of environment or scriptive environment is one that you are actually born into a hierarchy. It could be high, middle, or low, and your success in life is going to be within that hierarchy. Sometimes people call it a caste or a class, CLASS, that you're born into a specific class, and you may be able to get out of it and you may not. Now, an achievement society says that it doesn't really matter where you're born, that everybody has the ability to get out of where they're born and to move up in the world. Now, this little diagram to the right, which has a country, this is a little old because things are changing quite a bit, but you can see the achievement systems are Austria, Germany, UK, USA, Japan, compared to the inscription, which is Malaysia, Mexico, China, and Saudi Arabia. And what's important to know about this when you're communicating is that some people, when you're talking about that you can accomplish anything, in their mind they're thinking to themselves, no, I cannot. I was born into a certain hierarchy. I cannot. Or you may be talking to someone who says, yes, I was maybe born in this different class, but I can accomplish anything and do anything I want to. So that's the difference between the achievement and the inscription in terms of the different cultures. Last thing I will mention to you before we stop this part of the speech or presentation is about Geertz Hofstede. Now, Geertz Hofstede was a Dutch social psychologist, and he was an IBM employee. If you go back to the 1980s, IBM in the 1970s, IBM was at that point building offices all over the world, and they were taking their U.S. managers and putting them in Japan and China, Germany, Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt, over to Ireland. And what they found out very quickly is that certain of these offices did extremely well, operated very, very functionally, and other ones did not. And they couldn't quite figure it out. So they took Geertz Hofstede and they said, would you go out there and go to 70 of our different offices and look at all of them and try to figure out what is the problem? Why do some work better than others? Now, Geertz Hofstede actually came up, after going to all these, with what he called his cultural scale. In there, he identified 5 different things: power distance, individualism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty, avoidance, and long-term orientation. So he said that these are the 5 components of the culture, that each one is different, and he's going to rate them from 0 to 100. And in the next section of this presentation, part 2, we'll go through this in more detail and show you exactly how it worked. But for right now, this is the conclusion of part 1, and I hope you come and join me again as we talk about part 2 as we go into the Hofstede cultural scale.